The city was already wrapped in the cold, crisp blanket of December, and the office buzzed with an energy I found both foreign and irritating. The type of energy that only came when people started exchanging pleasantries about the holidays. Christmas music, eagerly pumped through the PA system, drifted across the room, drowning out the typical office hum. A Christmas carol played on a loop, cheerful and grating in equal measure. It felt like every single conversation was somehow about festive plans, family gatherings, or secret Santa exchanges. Everyone seemed to have someone to go home to, a place to be, a reason to smile. I didn't. I adjusted my tie, a casual one today, because who cared, and flipped open my laptop, eyes scanning the screen without actually processing the words. Something about the end of the year made everything feel heavier. The finality of it. The idea that another year had slipped through my fingers, and I was no closer to the things I'd once told myself I'd achieve. And it wasn't even the usual New Year's pressure. No, this felt different. This felt like a weight that had always been there. And now, it was growing heavier. Reed. Brandon's voice cut through my thoughts, pulling me back into the noisy reality of the office. He was already leaning against my cubicle wall, a grin plastered across his face. His eyes sparkled with that enthusiasm that I just couldn't relate to. Got plans for Christmas. Brandon was impossible to avoid. My best friend. My coworker. The one who never stopped smiling. The one who always had something planned, someone to talk to, and some party to attend. He was the kind of guy who thrived on the superficial social things, office parties, happy hours, big nights out. You know, the kind of guy who lived for the holidays, never really worrying about the kind of questions Christmas made you ask about your life. To him, it was all about having fun, even if it was a little forced. I ran a hand through my hair, pushing away the thought that had been gnawing at me all morning. What was I really doing? What was the point of all this? Christmas. I leaned back in my chair and looked at him, probably just hitting the bars like usual. No family to go back to, and you know how I feel about those big holiday dinners. You. Brandon's eyes twinkled with the kind of mischievous excitement that only he could generate. Well, this year's a little different. Haven invited me to her parents' house. I'll be with her and her family for Christmas. There was something about his casual mention of Haven, his girlfriend of 6 months, that made my stomach twist. I didn't show it, of course. Not openly. But I wasn't prepared for the sting. Oh. I nodded, swallowing the awkwardness. That's great. Really. I'm happy for you, man. Brandon laughed, a short, hearty sound. You don't sound happy. You sure you're okay with that? I mean, you know you're welcome to come too. You could crash at my place and hang with Haven's family. It'll be a blast. It's her parents' place, so it'll be one of those magical Christmases, you know. All about the food, the presents, the awkward conversations. He grinned. I'm sure they'd love to meet you. It's what? Your 3rd year running solo for the holidays. I stood up from my chair, pretending to adjust the stack of paperwork on my desk. Yeah, something like that. I forced a smile. But no thanks. I'm good, really. I'll just grab a drink with the usual crowd. Brandon's face fell a little, and for a brief moment, the cheerfulness seemed to slip away, as if he saw the cracks I was trying so desperately to hide. He shrugged, trying to recover his enthusiasm. All right, man. Just thought I'd offer. You sure? Yeah, I said, too quickly. Totally. I'm fine. But my voice trailed off. Even I wasn't sure what I was trying to convince him, or myself, of. Brandon's grin returned, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. I knew he wanted to say more, probably something about how I should spend time with someone during the holidays, but instead, he clapped me on the back with a little too much force, like he was trying to knock something out of me. Well, okay, if you're sure, he said, his voice turning lighter, less concerned. But hey, don't spend the whole time alone. I know you've got that whole, I don't do family thing, but everyone needs someone, Reed. Right, I muttered, half smiling. Someone. He gave me one last, lingering look before walking away, his footsteps fading into the noise of the office. I sat back down, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I couldn't focus. I couldn't breathe. The truth. The holidays weren't just a reminder of the families I had, but also the families I didn't. The Christmas dinners where the laughter was fake, where the smiles didn't quite reach anyone's eyes. The presents that didn't matter because they came with strings attached. My parents' fights over trivial things that seemed to always escalate in December. The constant tension that hung like a cloud over our home, promising that things would never be what they seemed. So I shut my laptop. I needed a drink, something to dull the ache in my chest. A few hours later, the office was practically deserted. Only the few die-hard workers were left behind, including Talia. She was sitting at her desk, typing away in a rhythmic, measured manner, as though nothing in the world could disturb her. Talia, the so-called cat lady of the office, though I had never once seen her interact with a cat in all the years I'd worked here. She wasn't exactly unfriendly, but she wasn't friendly either. Talia was the kind of person you saw in the corner of the room, quietly existing in a way that made you forget she was even there until you accidentally looked her way. I tried not to think about the fact that she was probably the only person left in the office. That meant I had to make small talk, right? Still here? I asked as I leaned against the cubicle divider, watching her type without looking up. I didn't know anyone actually worked past the holiday parties. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, and then slowly looked up at me with a raised eyebrow. Holiday parties aren't my thing, she said softly, her voice calm, almost too calm for the chaos around us. I don't have anyone to celebrate with. I chuckled bitterly. Same here, I muttered. Guess I'll be hitting the bars again this year, the usual. Just another Christmas by myself. Talia didn't respond with the awkward sympathy I expected. Instead, she simply nodded. Her expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet understanding that I couldn't place. You don't have to do that, she said suddenly. If you don't want to be alone, I mean. I blinked. What? Her gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something human in her eyes. I'm having dinner tomorrow, she said. If you're looking for something different, you're welcome to join. I'll be alone too. I stared at her for a long moment, unsure how to react. Talia? Inviting me to her house? To have dinner? I laughed awkwardly, trying to lighten the moment. That's surprisingly kind of you, but I'm serious, she interrupted, her tone quiet but firm. I don't want to spend Christmas alone. And well, you don't either, right? For a second, I wanted to refuse. It was so strange, so unexpected. But there was something in her offer that caught me off guard. Something real, unpretentious. All right, I said before I could think better of it. I'll come. Thanks. She nodded, and for the first time, I saw her smile. A small, quiet thing, but somehow warm. It was strange. Her invitation felt like a lifeline, an offer of something neither of us had expected. The rest of the evening felt different, a little less heavy. And as I left the office, the first real thought in my mind was that maybe, just maybe, this Christmas wouldn't be like all the others. Talia's desk was at the farthest corner of the office, tucked away in a little alcove that made her almost invisible to the rest of us. She was a fixture here, the kind of person who went unnoticed by most, unless, of course, you made it a point to look for her. And I'd never had a reason to. It wasn't that I disliked her, but we never really ran in the same circles. Talia was the quiet type, the kind who kept to herself, buried in work or her own world. And for someone like me, who thrived on noise and movement, she was as far from my radar as you could get. But tonight, something was different. The office, usually bustling with holiday chatter, was practically deserted. Most everyone had gone home to their families, or left for their weekend plans, already wrapped in the blanket of Christmas festivities. The few who remained were tapping away at their computers, finishing last-minute reports, or staring out the windows as the city began to glow with the lights of the season. I hadn't intended to linger. In fact, I had been about to grab my coat and hit the door when I noticed Talia sitting at her desk. It was late, later than usual. Most people would have packed up and gone home hours ago, but she was still here, typing away like she had nowhere else to be. Something about it caught my attention. The office was dim, the overhead lights buzzing faintly as I walked past her. There was no Christmas music anymore, no conversation, just the soft hum of the heating system and the occasional click of keys. I stood in the aisle between her cubicle and mine, unsure whether to leave her to her solitude or break the silence. She wasn't one for idle chatter, but I didn't want to go home just yet, either. I had nothing else to do, no place to go, and that empty feeling, the one I had been ignoring all day, was starting to nag at me again. Finally, I cleared my throat. Still here. Talia didn't flinch. She didn't even look up at first. Her fingers continued to dance across the keyboard, unbothered. "I've got work to finish," she replied, her voice steady, almost too calm for the quiet of the office. "I don't mind staying late." I didn't know why I felt compelled to engage, but I stepped closer to her cubicle, glancing at her screen. A spreadsheet. She wasn't doing anything special, just another one of those endless office tasks that everyone else was avoiding. I could have left, but something kept me rooted to the spot. She looked so comfortable in her solitude. It irritated me, but also intrigued me. "You sure it's just work?" I asked, a little more sharply than I intended. "Because it seems like you've got this whole 'I'm too busy for anything' vibe going on." I waved vaguely at the empty office, the few desks with their cold coffee cups and forgotten holiday cards. "You ever get tired of that? The whole alone thing?" Talia paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. For a moment, I thought she might ignore me completely, like she usually did with everyone else, but she turned her head slowly and gave me a look, a sharp, curious look that made me feel a little off balance. "I don't mind being alone," she said simply. "It's not about that. It's about getting things done." I tilted my head, taking in her response. "You don't mind being alone? Seriously?" She shrugged, her eyes drifting back to the screen, but I could still sense the weight in her words. "Alone doesn't mean lonely. There's a difference." I opened my mouth, about to fire back with something flippant, because that's what I did. But I found myself stalling, the words not coming. The way she said it, the certainty in her tone, had knocked me off course. It was so matter-of-fact, so unlike anyone else in this office who pretended to be content, pretending they had everything figured out just because they had a dinner party or a date night lined up. "Right," I said slowly, dragging my hand through my hair, suddenly feeling a little out of place. "Guess I haven't really thought about it that way." Talia didn't look at me again. She just returned to her work, but there was something in the way she carried herself, like she was used to being in control, even of her own space, even of her own solitude. It made me uncomfortable. I hated the feeling of being caught off guard, especially when it came from someone like her, the office cat lady. The nickname wasn't hers, of course. It was something I'd overheard from the guys in the break room. "That Talia chick, she's a total cat lady," Brandon had said once, back when he'd still tried to get everyone in the office to hang out. "You know she's got, like, 50 cats at home or something." They all laughed, because it was the kind of thing you'd laugh at when you didn't know someone and needed something to say to fill the silence. I had never asked her if it was true, and I never would. The last thing I wanted was to feel any more awkward than I already did. Still, it was hard to shake the image of her, this quiet, withdrawn woman who worked her life away, while everyone else went off to family dinners or holiday parties. I tried to shake off the feeling and move on. "Well, don't work too hard," I muttered as I turned toward the door. "Thanks for the concern," she said, her voice dry. "But I'll be fine." I stopped at the door, looking back at her once more. There was something in her expression, something fleeting, but there. She wasn't annoyed or cold, but there was a distance between us, an unspoken boundary she'd already established. She didn't want to get involved, and that was clear. The question lingered in my mind, though why was I still standing here? I glanced at my phone. 10 minutes until I could finally leave. The night was cold, and my bed was waiting, but there was this strange, nagging pull. I told Brandon I was fine, that I was okay spending Christmas alone. And part of me believed it, but the deeper part of me, the one I didn't like to listen to, wasn't sure. I didn't have family to go to. I didn't have plans. It was just me, the usual bar scene, the usual empty conversations. You going anywhere for Christmas? I asked before I could stop myself. The words were out, and I regretted them immediately. It wasn't like me to ask someone like Talia about their plans, if they even had any, but something about the quiet of the office and the way she'd made me think twice about my own life made me say it. She looked up, her brow furrowing slightly as if surprised I cared enough to ask. "No plans," she said, her voice soft. "I'll be here, alone, but that's fine," she added quickly, as though trying to convince herself. "I'm used to it." I nodded, feeling a sudden lump in my throat. "Yeah, me too." For a moment, the office felt even quieter. Her words hung in the air, and I realized how little I really knew about her. The woman I had barely spoken to in all the months of working here had just invited me into the part of her life I didn't know anything about, the one I had been too busy ignoring to notice. And in that quiet, offhand invitation, something shifted. I felt it, like the first snowflake of the season, when you know that a storm is coming, even though it's hard to tell when or how. "Well, good luck with everything," I said, the words awkward and out of place, but they were the best I could come up with. Talia offered a small, faint smile. "You too, Reed. Take care." And with that, I walked out into the night, the cold air biting at my skin, but something in me was warmer than before. Something was different. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it. And for the first time in a long time, I was uncertain about what the next day, Christmas Day, would bring. The sound of the door clicking shut behind me felt final, but as I stepped out into the quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that Talia's offer had somehow opened a door I hadn't known I was standing in front of. I hadn't expected to go to Talia's house, at least not until she had invited me. That was the last thing on my mind when I left the office that night, too busy sorting through my own internal mess to think about anything else. But here I was, standing in front of her apartment building, my breath misting in the cold night air. The holiday lights strung up across the building glowed faintly, soft and unpretentious. I glanced up at the window on the second floor where Talia's apartment was. No festive decorations, no wreaths, no cheerful chaos, just a dim light cutting through the curtains. I hadn't really thought this through. It wasn't like me to take someone up on an offer like this, especially not someone like Talia. She was, well, different. Quiet, private, maybe a little strange, even, but there was something about the invitation that had stayed with me. It wasn't like the casual pity I'd gotten from some coworkers, or the pity I tried to give myself. It felt real. It felt like she was offering me a slice of something real, something without the usual gloss of obligation or expectation. And if I'm being honest, it felt like the first time in a long time that I wasn't walking into a situation that would end with me closing myself off. I wasn't entirely sure why, but the thought of not going felt wrong. I knocked on her door, my stomach fluttering for reasons I couldn't explain. It opened quickly. "Hey," Talia said, standing there in an oversized sweater that swallowed her frame, her hair pulled back into a loose knot at the back of her head. She didn't smile widely, but there was something different about her tonight. More relaxed, more approachable. And that made me feel, oddly, at ease. "Hey," I replied, forcing a casual grin as I shifted my weight awkwardly from one foot to the other. Are you sure it's okay for me to be here?" Talia raised an eyebrow, as if the question was entirely unnecessary. "You're the one who showed up," she said, stepping aside to let me in. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but there was warmth in her voice, a quiet invitation I hadn't expected. I stepped inside, immediately hit by the warmth of the room and the faint scent of something simmering on the stove. The apartment wasn't anything fancy. Small, cozy, the walls lined with bookshelves and framed photographs. But it was inviting. More inviting than I had expected from someone who always appeared so distant. "Make yourself at home," she said, heading over to the kitchen where she was stirring a pot on the stove. "I wasn't sure what you'd like, so I made a little bit of everything." I hesitated at the entrance, glancing around the room. There were no cats. In fact, there was no sign of any pets at all, just a few plants in the corner, an assortment of knickknacks, and a large wooden table set for two. I cleared my throat. "No cats, huh? I figured you'd be the type." She looked up from the stove with a wry smile, her eyes glinting slightly with amusement. "I don't know why people assume I have 50 cats at home." She paused, stirring again. "I'm allergic to cats, actually. I prefer dogs." "Dogs?" I asked, a little surprised. I thought the cat lady thing was, well, a given. Talia gave a small, amused shrug, but there was something in the way she said it that made it clear she didn't really mind the nickname. It's just easier for people to label things than to actually understand them. I nodded thoughtfully, feeling a strange pang of recognition. I did the same thing. People had labeled me too. The party guy. The guy who'd never settle down. The one who was always too busy for anything real. Talia turned back to the stove, her voice softer now. "You can sit at the table if you want, or you could grab a drink from the fridge. I wasn't sure if you'd drink wine or something else." "Wine sounds good," I said, still caught off guard by the casualness of the whole thing. "Yeah, wine's fine." As she poured 2 glasses, I took a seat at the table, letting my eyes wander over the little details. This was her space, not the generic office version of herself. There was a kind of quiet harmony to it, a personal comfort that I hadn't expected from her. When she joined me at the table, she handed me a glass with a small smile. "Cheers," she said, clinking her glass gently against mine. We sat in silence for a while, sipping the wine, the sound of the city muffled by the closed windows. It felt surprisingly easy. "So," I began, still a little unsure where to start. "What made you invite me over tonight?" It was blunt, but I couldn't quite mask my curiosity. Not that I'm complaining or anything. Just, I didn't expect it, Talia looked at me, her gaze steady. "Because you're here," she said simply. "I don't want to be alone on Christmas. You don't either, right? And you seemed kind of like you could use a change in perspective." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For a second, I felt exposed. It was like she had somehow seen me, as if she knew more about me than I did about myself. But it wasn't accusatory. It wasn't judgmental. It was just honest. "I don't know about a change in perspective," I said after a long pause, sipping from my glass. "But I guess I'm here, aren't I?" "Exactly," she said with a small, knowing smile. "So let's make the best of it. For tonight, at least." The conversation shifted naturally after that. She asked me about my family, about why I didn't like to go home for the holidays, and I found myself telling her things I hadn't told anyone in years. I didn't even realize I was talking until the words were already out, spilling into the space between us, raw and unfiltered. "I don't know," I said, rubbing my hand over my face. "I guess Christmas just reminds me of things, bad things. Like the whole idea of family, It just feels like this big, unrealistic expectation, and I'm always left disappointed." Talia listened without interrupting, her gaze unwavering. There was something so quiet and accepting about her, something that made me feel like I could say more, like I could finally unload. My parents, they were always fighting, always pretending to be okay just for the sake of the holidays. One Christmas, they even sat me down and tried to act like everything was fine. And then they told me they were getting a divorce. I paused, the memory still stinging. That was the last Christmas we ever spent together as a family. Talia didn't say anything at first. She just nodded, as though she understood, or at least wasn't judging me for it. It was the most comforting thing I could remember in a long time. Her silence wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was like she was giving me space to feel it, without rushing in with advice or pity. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," she said softly after a while. "But sometimes, saying it out loud, it helps." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Yeah, well, it's been a long time coming. I guess I never really realized how much it still messes with me. Christmas just brings all that crap back." "I get it," she said. "You're not the only one who's lost something during the holidays." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "What do you mean?" Talia's expression softened as she set her glass down on the table. "I lost my son," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. 3 years ago. He was only 3. I was married then, and we spent Christmas with my in-laws. It was supposed to be a happy day, but he got sick, and then he just didn't make it." The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. It felt like the floor had shifted beneath me, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. What could I say? I had no frame of reference for that kind of loss. "I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling inadequate, but they were all I could muster. Talia gave a faint smile, a bittersweet one. "It's all right. I don't talk about it much, but sometimes it helps to remember. You're not the only one carrying something heavy." I nodded slowly, feeling something stirring in me, a kind of connection, a mutual understanding that wasn't about pity, but about shared pain. There was comfort in that, in the unspoken bond that formed between us, over our differences, our losses, our loneliness. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but somehow, in the quiet space of her apartment, with the soft glow of the Christmas lights flickering in the window, it felt like we were both learning what it meant to truly be with someone, to simply exist together without pretense. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so the days leading up to Christmas felt like a blur. I was still processing the quiet, unexpected comfort I found in Talia's apartment. It wasn't just the warm dinner or the easy conversation that stuck with me. It was the way her presence had felt like an anchor. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not just in the way people notice you in a crowded room, but in a way that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. I hadn't expected Talia to be so human, I guess. For all her office mystique, the cat lady persona, the quiet, almost invisible worker bee, I hadn't expected her to carry so much weight in her words, her silence. I hadn't expected her to understand, but I wasn't ready to confront the significance of that night just yet. I had a lifetime of habits that involved running from anything that felt like connection, so when Christmas Eve arrived and Talia sent me a text to check in on how I was doing, I almost didn't reply. Almost. "How's the night going? You all right?" The message read. I stared at it for a long time, a knot tightening in my stomach. I didn't really want to admit how I was feeling. I didn't want to confront the fact that Christmas wasn't just another night for me anymore. That maybe I was looking for something, and that something had become this unexpected, hesitant bond with Talia. I looked at the text again, and without thinking too much about it, typed back, "Yeah, just here, just me and the usual." I was too scared to say more, too scared to admit that the usual felt empty this year, that the bars and the parties I used to escape to were starting to feel like distractions. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. "I get it, but if you want to come by for a bit, you're welcome. I'm not doing much, just catching up on some reading. If you want to avoid the usual, whatever it is." There it was. The invitation. Simple. No expectations. Just space. I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the screen, But then I hit send. All right, I'll come by. No pressure. I didn't know what I expected when I knocked on her door that evening. Maybe it was the familiar, hollow anticipation that usually came with any situation I couldn't quite control. But when Talia opened the door, there was no awkwardness. No, what are we doing here? Kind of energy. Just a quiet, calm smile. Hey, she greeted me, her voice warm. Come in. The apartment was dimly lit, but this time, the soft glow of a small Christmas tree in the corner added a festive touch. It wasn't extravagant, just a few ornaments, some twinkling lights, and a star perched at the top. But it made the place feel alive, somehow. Warm. Make yourself comfortable, she said, gesturing to the couch. I'm just about to start a movie. Thought it might be nice to actually watch something holiday-themed for once. I figured you might be in the mood to just relax. Holiday-themed. I chuckled, sinking into the couch. You sure that's a good idea? It's hard enough to get through the commercials on TV, let alone a full movie. Talia raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by my hesitation. It's a classic, she said, slipping a DVD into the player. You might actually like it. Love Actually. It's not all about the perfect Christmas. It's about, well, life. And all the messiness that comes with it. I raised an eyebrow. I thought that was a rom-com. Talia grinned. It is, but it's also about people finding their way through life, and not everything is wrapped up with a bow. I think that's what makes it real. I leaned back into the couch, allowing myself to relax, the tension in my body loosening just a little. Maybe it was the wine we'd had earlier, or maybe it was just the effect of being here, in this space that felt like nothing I'd ever known. I didn't have to perform, didn't have to pretend to be the life of the party. I could just exist, and for the first time in a while, that felt like enough. As the opening credits rolled, Talia settled next to me on the couch, the space between us just enough to keep things comfortable. Neither of us said much for a while. The movie played on, its familiar soundtrack filling the quiet, but neither of us seemed too invested in the plot. We were just there, together, and that in itself felt like a small victory. I had to admit, Talia's company was different, in a way that was hard to articulate, but easy to feel. She didn't force conversation. She didn't pressure me into talking. She just was, and that was more than enough. Halfway through the movie, Talia spoke up, her voice a little quieter than usual. You know, I didn't always like Christmas, she said, her eyes still on the screen, but her tone suddenly serious. It was just another day, another reminder of what I'd lost. She paused, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the blanket on the couch. But I think this year, I'm finally starting to get it, what it's supposed to be. I glanced at her, trying to read her expression, but it was hard to tell what she was feeling. What do you mean? I asked. Talia turned her head toward me then, her gaze a little more vulnerable than it had been before. Christmas isn't about being happy all the time. It's about living through everything, the good, the bad, and all the moments in between. I spent so many years trying to avoid the sadness, trying to pretend I wasn't broken, but it doesn't work like that. The holidays, they just make you feel all of it. I swallowed, the weight of her words settling on my chest. I hadn't expected her to open up like this, not after what we'd shared the other night. But there she was, letting me see a little more of her, peeling back a layer that I didn't think I'd ever get to touch. Yeah, I said, my voice quieter than usual. I get that. Talia nodded, her eyes flicking back to the screen, but I could tell she wasn't really watching it anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere deep inside, where all her grief and her strength coexisted in ways I was only beginning to understand. It's funny, she said, her voice almost lost in the hum of the movie. The holidays have a way of forcing you to deal with everything you've been ignoring. All the stuff you shove away, it comes out. But maybe that's what makes it real. I didn't have a perfect response to that. How could I? I was still figuring out what it meant to be real, to feel what I was feeling without running from it. But I could appreciate her perspective, even if I wasn't quite there yet. We sat in silence for a while after that, the movie playing on, but it didn't feel awkward. The conversation had opened a door, and I wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in ages, I wasn't afraid of what might come next. The movie ended with the usual holiday sentiment, but Talia didn't get up immediately. She stayed sitting next to me, her presence a quiet comfort that I hadn't expected to find here. "Thanks for coming over, Reed," she said softly, her voice almost like a whisper, but her words felt like a promise. "It's good to have someone to share this with." I glanced over at her, surprised by the depth of her sincerity. "No problem. Honestly, it was good to just not be alone tonight." She smiled faintly. "Yeah, I get it. Sometimes it's the simplest things that make all the difference." And in that moment, I realized that maybe it wasn't about trying to make everything perfect or running from the pain. Maybe it was about letting the moments be what they were, messy, imperfect, but real. And with Talia, for the first time in a long time, I was starting to feel that. The night ended slowly, with no grand epiphany or overwhelming sense of closure. Just two people, sitting together, sharing space and time in a way that felt natural. For once, I didn't have to try to make it anything else. It was enough. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of muted quiet that only the holiday season can bring. Soft, almost reverential, as if the world had paused for just a moment to breathe. I woke up alone, the silence in my apartment pressing in on me from all sides. The parties, the people, the noise that usually filled my life. It was all gone. Empty. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the day pulling at me. Christmas wasn't supposed to feel like this. It was supposed to feel different, like the energy of the season could at least fill in the gaps where I didn't know how to. I checked my phone. No messages. It was a holiday, sure, but that didn't matter much to me. Everyone else had their families, their plans. I had Talia's invitation. That was something. I had texted her the night before, just to let her know I'd be coming over later in the day, and I hadn't expected her to reply, but she did. Her message had been simple. "I'm glad you're coming. I'm making a roast. You can help, if you want. I'm no expert, but it should be fun." I hadn't quite figured out what fun looked like with Talia. The night we'd spent watching that rom-com hadn't been fun in the usual sense. It had been something else. Something quieter, more comfortable. But for some reason, the idea of being with her on Christmas felt strangely right. I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the simplicity of her invitation, or the way she made everything feel a little more real. By the time I made my way to her apartment, the streets were quiet. The usual bustle of the city had been replaced by a hush, the sounds of distant laughter or music occasionally piercing through the stillness, but it all felt distant, like it was happening in some other world. The one where people had families and traditions, and weren't alone on Christmas. I knocked on her door, the sound muffled by the soft snow that had begun to fall outside. It felt almost dreamlike. When Talia opened it, she looked surprised but pleased, her face flushed slightly from the warmth inside. "Hey," I said, offering a hesitant smile. "You ready for this?" Talia raised an eyebrow, a half smile forming. "I'm ready if you are. But we're not quite at the grand dinner part yet. The roast still has a while to go." "I'm not sure how helpful I'll be in the kitchen," I said, stepping inside. The apartment smelled amazing. Rich and savory, with hints of garlic and rosemary. It was the kind of comforting smell you'd get from a meal that was made slowly with care. "You can help by keeping me company," she said, taking a step back to let me in. "It's much less lonely when there's someone to share the space with." I followed her into the kitchen, where a large roast sat in the oven. She was humming softly to herself as she checked on it, her movements efficient but relaxed. There were more decorations now than I remembered, red and gold ribbons hanging from the windows, little candles flickering on the counters. The room felt alive in a way that I hadn't expected. I leaned against the counter, watching her, feeling oddly at ease. The difference between this moment and any of my other Christmases was like night and day. There was no pressure, no expectations, no need to pretend everything was perfect. "You've got a nice setup here," I said, glancing around. "I didn't expect it to be like this." Talia gave me a wry smile, glancing over her shoulder at me. "What were you expecting? Cats everywhere." She chuckled softly. "I may be that lady, but I'm not a total cliché." "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's just warmer, more real, I guess." Her expression softened, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. She just focused on adjusting the roast, a quiet smile on her lips. I couldn't quite place what it was. Maybe the simple joy she seemed to take in making this dinner, or the way she'd invited me into her world without any strings attached. "Sometimes," she said, breaking the silence, "you have to create the kind of Christmas you want. No one else is going to do it for you." I looked at her, trying to process her words, but I didn't have time to respond before she turned and asked, "You want to help with the potatoes? They're ready to be mashed." I didn't know how to cook, but for some reason, I found myself walking over to the stove, picking up a potato masher. It felt right. The small domestic tasks, the way her world was so different from mine, but in a way that made me feel like I was exactly where I needed to be. As I mashed the potatoes, Talia began setting the table. We didn't talk much at first, just worked together, and the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that made you realize how much you could say without saying anything at all. When the food was ready, we sat down together at her small dining table. The roast, the mashed potatoes, a salad, and a bottle of wine between us. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was more than I'd ever expected. We clinked glasses, and Talia smiled at me as she took a sip. "Merry Christmas," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Merry Christmas," I echoed, a sense of gratitude I hadn't anticipated swelling in my chest. The food was better than I'd expected. Rich, savory, the flavors a warm comfort on a cold day. We didn't talk much while we ate. We didn't need to. The quiet was companionable, easy. It was the kind of space that made me realize how long it had been since I'd been around someone without feeling like I needed to fill every silence with noise. After dinner, we moved to the couch. The room was dim except for the soft glow of the Christmas lights, the tree twinkling in the corner. We sat in silence for a while, the hum of the city outside barely audible, the air between us charged with a quiet tension I couldn't place. Talia shifted, glancing over at me. "I'm glad you came over," she said softly. "I know it's not the big, happy Christmas that people expect, but—" She trailed off, her fingers nervously twining together. I looked at her, my mind suddenly clearer than it had been in days. "It's better than anything I expected." She met my gaze, her eyes holding something I hadn't seen before, vulnerability. A quiet, unspoken understanding passed between us. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was just the sheer honesty of the moment, but I felt something shift. I had spent so long building walls around myself, keeping everything at a distance. But in this room, with her, I felt like I could finally breathe. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't the kind of silence that came with loneliness. It was just us. No pretenses, no expectations. "So," I said, after a long while, "what's next for us?" Talia paused, then gave a soft, knowing smile. "Next, I think we just keep letting it happen, whatever it is." I smiled at that, leaning back into the couch, feeling the weight of everything I'd been carrying loosen just a little. "I'm okay with that," I said. "For the first time, in a long time, I think I'm okay with that." And for once, the space between us didn't feel like a gap to be crossed. It felt like the beginning of something new, something real. We sat there for a long time, the world outside continuing on, But for the first time in ages, it didn't matter. This moment, this quiet space between us, was enough. The days between Christmas and New Year's passed in a quiet, almost surreal haze. Everything seemed to slow down, like time itself had decided to take a breath. I had been spending more time with Telia. Those unexpected, small moments when we shared something other than just physical space. There was no rush, no pressure to define what it was between us. It just was. But despite how comfortable I had become in her presence, there was a gnawing feeling inside of me. It wasn't about her. It was about me. About my past. About the life I'd created for myself, full of distractions and superficiality, and how, somewhere along the way, I had lost touch with the things that really mattered. Talia was a mirror in a way I hadn't anticipated. She saw things about me that I hadn't allowed anyone to see in a long time. And more than that, she made me feel things I had been burying. Things I didn't know how to handle. The walls I'd built for protection started to crumble, little by little. But as each layer fell, I felt exposed. Uncertain. The truth was, I had been running from my past for so long. Christmas, of all things, had finally forced me to face the reality I'd spent years avoiding. My family. The unresolved, messy parts of my childhood that still haunted me. I had avoided Christmas for so many years because I couldn't bear the idea of spending it with people who had broken me in ways I couldn't forget. But now, there was a new question on my mind. Could I really live my life, build something real, with these cracks in me? Could I keep moving forward, knowing that I had left so many parts of myself behind? It was New Year's Eve, and the office was quieter than usual. I was sitting at my desk, staring blankly at the screen, when a message popped up on my phone from Talia. I smiled at the sight of her name. "Hey, what are you doing tonight?" "I'm going to a small gathering with a couple of friends. I was thinking it might be nice if you came." No pressure, just a chill evening. I stared at the message for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. I had promised myself that I wouldn't go into the year running from the same problems that had plagued me for so long. But there was still a part of me that felt scared. It wasn't about Talia. It was about what came after that. I typed back after a pause. "Yeah, sure. I'll come by. I could use something different for once." The reply was quick. "Great. See you soon." As I drove over to her apartment that evening, the night was cold and crisp. Snow was falling lightly, and there was a quiet hush in the streets, as though the city itself was holding its breath. The familiar rhythm of the world seemed distant, and in that moment I realized I had been letting it slip by for too long. The weight of all those unresolved emotions was finally catching up with me. When I knocked on Talia's door, she opened it with that warm, inviting smile of hers. Her dark hair was loosely tied back, and she wore a cozy sweater and jeans, casual, but effortlessly put together. "Hey, you made it," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "You look good. You okay?" Yeah, just thinking," I replied, trying to keep it casual. I had been thinking a lot these past few days, and I wasn't sure how to articulate any of it. It was like this heaviness I couldn't shake. But for some reason, just standing in her presence, I felt a little lighter. We exchanged a few pleasantries as she led me into her living room, where a handful of people were already gathered. It wasn't a big party, just a few close friends, laughing and chatting softly. The atmosphere was different from what I was used to. It wasn't the loud, chaotic energy I had once found so alluring. This felt peaceful, comfortable, safe. I grabbed a drink and sat down beside her on the couch, the weight of the evening's quiet hanging in the air between us. As we watched her friends talk about their plans for the new year, I couldn't help but wonder, could I actually change? Could I let go of the defenses I'd built over all these years? Talia seemed to sense my restlessness. "Hey," she said quietly, nudging me with her shoulder. "What's going on in that head of yours?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Just thinking about things, you know." Like I'd spent so many years avoiding what really matters. My family. Myself. I don't know if I can keep running from it. Talia looked at me, her eyes steady and knowing. She had seen me struggle, but she had also seen me open up in ways I hadn't with anyone else. You can't run forever, she said softly. I think you know that. But running is easy. Facing it, that's harder. I get it. I do. I turned to look at her, surprised by how much I wanted to hear her say that. You really think I can do it? Face all the shit I've been ignoring? She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. I think you're stronger than you realize, but the first step, it's all on you. Her words struck me harder than I expected. She was right. I had spent so long convincing myself that avoiding my past, that keeping it locked away, was the way to survive. But it wasn't. Not anymore. I sat back in the couch, thinking. The longer I stayed in this bubble with Talia, the more I realized I was being called to do something, to take that first step. Suddenly, a thought hit me. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about trying to make things right. About finding a way back to the people who had once been part of my life. My parents. I had been estranged from them for so long, but Talia's strength, her honesty about her own pain, had pushed me to see something in myself I hadn't wanted to before. The courage to change. Later that evening, as the clock ticked toward midnight, Talia and I slipped outside for a breath of fresh air, the chill of the new year settling around us like a blanket. The city lights twinkled softly in the distance, the world still and calm. I've been thinking, I said, breaking the silence between us. I think I need to talk to my mom, to really talk to her. It's been too long. Too much time lost. Talia looked at me, her expression a mixture of surprise and warmth. I'm glad you're saying that, she said softly. Sometimes it's the hardest step to take, but it's the one that matters most. I nodded, feeling a sense of finality settle in my chest. For the first time in years, I felt ready. Ready to confront the past that had haunted me. Ready to face my family and try to rebuild the relationship I thought was beyond repair. Thanks, Talia, I said quietly. For everything. She smiled, her eyes soft. You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're starting to see yourself again. Sometimes, it's all about finding the courage to take the first step. I took a deep breath, staring out at the quiet night, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something that resembled hope. As the new year came in, I knew I was about to face one of the hardest decisions of my life. But I also knew I wasn't doing it alone anymore. Talia had opened a door, and I wasn't about to turn back. The call to action had been made, and I was ready to step into the unknown. The first time I called my mom in years, my hand was shaking so badly that I had to set my phone down for a moment. The feeling of that weight in my chest was familiar, the hesitation, the anxiety. But this time, it was different. This time, I wasn't calling to argue or to avoid the inevitable. I was calling because I wanted to repair something, because I knew that if I didn't take this step, I would never truly be free of the ghosts that had haunted me for so long. The air was cold that morning, winter still firmly holding the city in its grasp. Talia had been with me all morning, helping me prepare for this. Not physically, she had gone back to work, leaving me with the quiet hum of the apartment. But emotionally, she had been a steady presence, her words of encouragement still echoing in my mind. Just start with the truth, she told me before she left. Tell her you want to understand. Tell her you're ready. And I was ready. The decision had been made. I took a deep breath and pressed the call button, the sound of the ringing tone filling the quiet room. It felt like an eternity before she picked up. Hello. Her voice was warm, familiar, but strained. I hadn't heard it in years, not in any real way. There had been birthdays, anniversaries, a few awkward text messages here and there, but nothing that went beyond the surface. Nothing real. Mom, I said, my voice sounding foreign even to my own ears. It felt like I was speaking through a fog. It's Reed. I wanted to talk. There was a long pause, the silence stretching between us like an old, unworn bridge. I could almost hear her heart skipping, her mind racing to place where this call was coming from. "Reed," she said, her voice tentative. "It's been a while. What's going on?" I had expected this. I had expected the distance, the awkwardness, the uncertainty. But that didn't stop the weight of it from settling heavy on my chest. "I know," I said quietly. "I know it's been too long. I've been thinking a lot. About everything. About what happened with us." There was a sound on the other end, almost like a sigh, but I couldn't tell if it was relief or regret. "Reed, I don't know what to say. You've kept your distance for so long." "I know," I interrupted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I've kept my distance because I was afraid. But I'm not afraid anymore. I want to understand what happened. I want to know if it's possible to fix things." There was a long silence again, but this time it felt different. There was an openness in the air, a possibility. "Reed," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's going to take time. I can't promise things will be like they were, but I'm willing to try. I never stopped loving you. I didn't know how to fix what was broken." I could hear the emotion in her voice, and suddenly, all the anger, all the resentment I'd held onto for so long, felt smaller, less important. This wasn't about the past anymore. It was about moving forward. "I'm willing to try too," I said, my voice steady now. "I'm not asking for everything to be perfect, but I want to try." She was quiet for a moment, and I imagined her sitting there, processing everything I'd said. Then she spoke again, her voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that. I'd really like that." I nodded, though I knew she couldn't see me. "Okay, let's start slow. Maybe we can have dinner next weekend. Just talk. No pressure. Just talk." "That sounds nice," she said, a tremor in her voice. "I'd like that." "Okay, I'll call you next week then. Take care of yourself, Reed," she said softly. "I love you. I love you too, Mom." The words felt easier this time, like they were no longer a weight on my chest, but a breath I had been holding for years. "I'll see you soon." As I hung up the phone, the silence of the apartment was no longer oppressive. It felt open, like I had just made room for something new, something that had been waiting for a long time to be acknowledged. I didn't expect the flood of emotions that came after. There was no grand catharsis, no immediate sense of relief. Instead, it was a quiet understanding that things would take time. And that was okay. Talia was waiting for me when I got back to her place. She had been checking in with me throughout the day, offering words of encouragement, but now it was time for me to share the news with her. I found her in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she stirred something in a pot on the stove. The soft sound of the music she put on filled the room, and I felt a deep sense of peace settle in my chest just from being in her presence. She was grounded in a way I had never known before. "Hey," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "I did it." Talia turned, her eyes brightening at my words. "You called?" "Yeah," I said, smiling faintly. "We're going to meet next weekend. Just talk. No expectations." "That's huge, Reed," she said, her voice full of warmth. She set the spoon down and came over to where I stood, placing her hands on my arms. "I'm proud of you." I exhaled a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "It doesn't feel like much, but I guess it's a start." "It's everything," she said softly. "Taking that first step, it's huge. You're doing the right thing." "I couldn't have done it without you," I admitted, feeling a small pang of vulnerability. "You've helped me more than I can say." Talia smiled at me, her eyes soft with understanding. "I'm just here, Reed. You've been doing the work. I'm just lucky enough to be here when you're ready to see it." We stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other. I wasn't sure where this was going, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. The phone call with my mom had cracked something open in me, something I had locked away for years. But the real change hadn't happened on the phone call. It happened here, in this quiet apartment, with Talia standing in front of me, offering me something I hadn't known I needed, a safe space to be myself. "I think this is the beginning of something good," I said, more to myself than to her, but she heard me, and she nodded, her smile warm and reassuring. "I think so too," she said, her voice full of hope. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. It wasn't complete, but it was enough. It was a new beginning, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that I could rebuild, that I could find a way to move forward, into a future where I wasn't running anymore, a future where I wasn't afraid to let people in. And that future, it looked a little brighter with Talia by my side.